Justin, thank you for making the time to be in this conversation. I've been looking forward to it. And why don't we just start with you? Tell us about you and how you ended up at Google.org, and you know, what's your motivation for why you do the work that you do?
You're starting with the hardest question because you know I don't like to talk about myself. I'll try to make this one really quick, but I had a turning point in college that I think probably launched me on this trajectory. I was an engineering student at the University of Virginia. I went back home to Seattle where I grew up, and I was doing an internship with the NAACP. And we, at the time, this was almost 20 years ago, we were facing a lot of the similar challenges of what we're facing now. The city was on fire because an unarmed black man had been shot by an off-duty police officer, and I got to be a fly on the wall with the mayor and the police chief, and I was marching with the churches in the Central District and kind of leaning into that whole space. And the president of the NAACP chapter was also an engineer, so I'm kind of like juxtaposing this like social justice, engineering, you know, and trying to figure out like I'm really passionate about justice issues. I also just have this really curious mind. I love engineering. So I went back to UVA. I finished out my engineering degree, but I got super involved with the National Society of Black Engineers. I got really engaged in justice work and decided when I graduated to sort of pivot out of engineering. I was a chemical engineer, so I was doing like research and development on pharmaceutical drugs, and I just thought, I like it, but I don't love it. I'd like to sort of try to stay closer to justice issues. And you know, long story short, I ended up at Harvard doing a joint business policy degree, spent 5 years in the nonprofit sector, and then Google kind of plucked me out, and here I am.
All right. Well, let's talk about Google.
Yeah.
We are, you know, I've heard that Google is arguably the world's most impactful social enterprise. I've heard that claim, and I think there's a lot to that.
Yeah.
And then we're in the middle of maybe a tech lash right now.
Yeah.
What parts of the criticism leveled on Google and other technology companies, you know, kind of the big technology companies, do you feel are fair, constructive criticism that's really causing a lot of, you know, conversation within the company?
Yeah. It's one of the things I really admire about the company, I think, is the honest self-reflection and the willingness to sort of call ourselves out. And we're pretty famous for calling ourselves out for not being diverse enough, for not having enough people of color and women across all positions within the company, and really trying to lean into that challenge. And look, I mean, tech companies hold incredible influence and sway over sort of culture and, you know, all of our day-to-day lives. And we're private capitalist institutions, right? We're not democratically elected. There's not necessarily a huge public voice that goes into the decision making. So I do think a lot of that criticism is actually a healthy thing, right? It's healthy to have the public questioning what do we want our values to be, and how do we want them to be reflected, and what's the impact of technology on our lives and our kids and our, you know, on all of it. So, you know, I think a lot of the criticism is actually a really a healthy thing for us to be engaged in. I think certainly on the Google.org front, where we're trying to lean into, you know, what's the impact on the most disadvantaged and socially marginalized communities. That's where we try to lean into our work every day and figure out, you know, can we open up more opportunity? Are we listening to the community? Where's that sort of healthy balance and conversation? And
so with Google.org, what are you know, what's the philosophy over there, and what are the priorities right now in terms of funding?
Yeah, so you know, Google.org is the philanthropy arm of Google, and we sort of call it like tech-driven philanthropy for good. And you know, we're the largest corporate philanthropy in the Bay Area, so we give a lot of money locally and try to make sure that we take care of the communities around our offices. You know, but we give over $200 million annually across the globe as well, and so. You know, there's a mix of employee giving that comes through just matching employee gifts, and then, you know, about half of it that's discretionary that a team of myself and my colleagues have the privilege of being able to go out and just try to find the best ideas. And it's a lot what you might expect. It's, you know, we're investing in innovation. We really, like I said earlier, try to have a focus on the most disadvantaged and marginalized communities. Obviously, we like things that scale. A lot of times, tech solutions are things that scale well. So obviously, we have a pretty high concentration of tech, including lots of fast-forward organizations in our cohort, too. We've given almost $2 million to Fast Forward and the organizations that have come through. So we've been a huge believer and supporter of Fast Forward organizations.
And in addition to financial resources, a lot of us here are running organizations where we're engineering constrained. How does Google.org, you know, use its engineering? I mean, you guys have like some of the best engineers on the planet.
Right.
Is there a way to tap into the engineering and kind of technology resources of the company?
It's always our aspiration to do more than just the money. We always say sort of grants plus Google, but it is honestly one of the hardest things to do. When Google.org first started, Google.org 1.0, I don't know what we're on now, like 5 or 6.0.
Yeah.
We've gone through lots of iterations. But Larry wrote in the IPO letter to the investors that his aspiration was that one day Google.org would eclipse Google in terms of social impact on the world, which is saying a lot because the founders of Google and the executives of Google believe very deeply in the social value inherent in the products that the company is building. So the aspiration has always been that Google.org would be a force for good beyond just the financial resources, but also through engineering. And we started with huge engineering teams. We sort of, I think, have owned up to the fact that it was more challenging than what we expected it to be. Some of the products didn't perform as well as we would have liked. The pendulum sort of swung. For a period, we were pretty close to a pure philanthropic, just sort of monetary giving mechanism. And I think we're kind of in a period of the pendulum swinging back a little bit more, where we're really trying to like lean into skill-based volunteering projects with our grantees, but also exploring the idea of what would it look like to have more dedicated resources within the company, just thinking on a day-to-day basis about how to build products that might not have the sort of outsized commercial value that some Google products have, but really have outsized social impact value. So, on my teams, we've sent, I see some of my colleagues in the audience who lead these projects, skill-based volunteering with our grantees. We just finished one with the Center for Policing Equity, where we sent 10 software engineers in our New York office for 6 weeks. They sort of sat with the Center for Policing Equity team. CPEs built the nation's first justice database to track police use of force and stops and disaggregate that data by race. We were reeling, like everybody else, around the Philando Castile shootings, the Alton Sterling shooting, the Mike Brown, the Eric Gardner, the list goes on. And our engineers kind of came to Google.org and said, well, give us the data. We'll crunch the data. We'll see what the patterns are. We have something to sort of add to try to figure this problem out. And I literally had to look at them and say, the data doesn't exist.
Yeah.
All of the data for the 15,000 law enforcement agencies across the country exists in these isolated pockets at the municipal level, and nobody makes them report into a centralized database, so you can't compare across departments. You can't get visibility into a single department. Samsung Yamwe, who's a Fast Forward cohort member who we've done some modest support for, is working on that challenge. And the Center for Policing Equity, who we funded, is really leaning into that. And these 10 engineers spent 6 weeks helping to geolocate a lot of the police use of force incidents that were in the database and significantly reduce the errors. To be able to turn a report around for a police department takes a long time because of all the errors in the data, and so automating that process. Things that are actually relatively simple on the scale of engineering and technical challenge, but unfortunately the nonprofit sector isn't resourced in a way to even do a lot of those types of things. So we really try to lean into those when we can.
And so that's something that you lead, specifically at Google.org, is the work to advance racial equity, racial justice. And you all have spent, over $40 million since 2015 on this issue. Data and helping kind of create more data transparency seems like a lever point. Can you talk about some of the other lever points that you all see in terms of advancing racial equity?
Yeah, the racial equity work has been really, I'm just curious, how many people have heard of Google doing racial justice work? I'm just kind of curious to show of hands. All right, that's actually a good number of people. We were flying under the radar for a long time, and I was getting criticized internally a little bit for, not sort of telling the world about it more, and it's good to see that people have heard of it. I think one of the things that we've really tried to do is, you're trying to figure out the systemic piece, right? So, a lot of times people will come to me knowing that we're doing racial justice work, and they'll say, hey, I've got a great sort of, for instance, an after-school program that's serving black and brown young people and trying to provide opportunity. And I think the world of those programs, when I spent 5 years at a nonprofit called Year Up, and that's exactly what we were doing, in the trenches, day-to-day work with young people trying to bridge the opportunity divide. But my pushback is always, look, what we're trying to do with our racial justice portfolio is really attack things at a systemic level. right? There's the sort of the mass sort of racism and bias that persists in society. There's the ways that that gets translated in through systems like our education system, like our criminal justice system. And if we're really going to tackle these problems in a significant way, you've got to get at that root cause systems level. And so what you're trying to do with the Center for Policing Equity is get in there and like disrupt that system of unequitable policing. Or in the educational systems, like how can we work at a systems level and sort of disrupt things? So our approach has been, obviously data science is huge because it's authentic to us, but we've also funded things like the Lynching in America project with Brian Stevenson that challenges the narrative around race in this country. Right, and it's access to information and new information. I think the country needs to be able to, wrestle and get past some of the systemic parts of the problem.
So there's the systemic level, and then just at the very personal level, if I'm interested, what advice would you have for me if I'm interested in doing something about racial inequality? Yeah. Where do I get started? What advice would you have?
I think Sixto was referencing DeRay McKesson's talk yesterday where he was talking about the importance of being closest to the people who are closest to the pain. Brian Stevenson talks a lot about this principle of proximity. If you're really going to take a first step in trying to understand and work on these challenges, you've got to get proximate. And I think the importance of that is because what we've done through systemic racism is essentially dehumanize people, right? I mean, we've taken people's humanity and we've made them an other or an it, right? And when that happens, when people become dehumanized and they're not really a person, it's very easy to sort of marginalize them and forget about them on the margins. And I think what happens when you sort of exercise that principle of proximity is you get in touch with people's humanity. Like you feel it in a very visceral way. And I think if somebody tries to take on a really tough topic like racial equity without taking that first step of just becoming proximate, of listening, of following, of allowing yourself to feel people's humanity and listen, that's got to be the first step. And it's been an interesting journey, being in a seat of privilege and power with my teammates, trying to figure out how can we hold that space and be proximate and humble as we sort of lean into the work and really not necessarily say and beat our chest and talk about how Google's tackling racial equity work, but really like how do we give others the platform and lift up others, it's been the approach.
I was just thinking about humility, which you mentioned, and then the work that you're doing around bias and prejudice. And then in January, the memo comes out from one of your colleagues. How did that affect things, at Google.org in terms of your priorities, the conversation internally? Just tell us where you were when that happened and when you learned of it.
Well, I was going to sleep, and I did the obligatory Friday night, let me just check my email real quick just to see if anything's sort of happening in the world before I lay my head down to rest. And my box is flooded full of these references. You need to, take that. My box is full of these references to this memo. And the first reaction is a personal one, right? The first reaction is a human one of this is awful. How could this happen? But to be honest, I don't know that it's necessarily impacted the way that we've done our work. We've been leaning into this intersection of social identity and poverty for a long time. We know that, at least in the United States, the most marginalized people tend to share that intersectional identity of both being impoverished and sharing a social identity that sort of puts you on the margins. And we know, in the gender space that's been a real challenge. And that's, we've already supported a lot of organizations. I know one of the Fast Forward cohort, Callisto, is one of the organizations that we supported around sexual assault. And so if anything, it's been us just trying to lean back into those grantees for thoughts and for advice, and making sure that, the company sees what we've done in that space already, sort of doubling down on that effort.
Google is, famous for taking risks, moonshots, and I imagine that translates over to .org. Of your failures for Google.org in terms of, investments that didn't quite pan out in terms of the impact that you thought it might have or how catalytic it could be, What patterns do you see?
Ooh, talk about my failures. You know, I'll share one example. You know, when we started the racial justice work, you know, we wanted to do, again, to the principle of proximity, we really wanted to be in solidarity with some of the movement leaders, the folks who are leading the movement for Black Lives, you know, closest to the pain. And some of those folks in those circles had some pretty ambitious ideas about how to use technology to fuel the movement, and not just leveraging existing platforms and being intermediated by existing platforms, but really with the desire to create their own platforms that were sort of owned and controlled by the movement. And we got behind some of those ideas in a pretty big way. And I think we certainly learned a lot from just being in proximity and solidarity with those leaders through that work. But I think what we learned, and this is sort of a lesson that we've learned across a number of grantees, not just in this case, but if you don't have the technical talent, I think I heard Megan Smith earlier talking about one of the great things about working with Sixto's organization is that he's got the engineering talent, the computer science talent to be able to take some of the technical challenges on. I think one of the lessons that we've learned is if the organizations don't have the technical talent, it's awfully hard to come up with like not even I was gonna say like a Google level type of technical solution, but even just an ambitious technical solution is really hard to achieve. And we've seen some of these grantees sort of spin their wheels trying to figure out how to build these platforms. And we'll bring our engineers to come in on the back end and audit the product and take a look at what they've created and have a lot of candid feedback about this just isn't MVP ready. This isn't going to accomplish what the organization's sort of aspiration is. And so I've sort of learned that if a nonprofit who has an ambition to create a technical product but hasn't ever done that type of thing, they better have a really rock-solid technical team on board in order to be able to create it. And I don't even know if I would call those failures, so to speak. I mean, we're supposed to sort of iterate, take risks, learn a lot as we go. So I don't think the company views those as investments we shouldn't have made, but rather learning opportunities. Let's take that knowledge, let's go back, and you know, in the next investments, look for those critical factors that are going to lead to success.
Okay. So I have one final question, and then I'd love folks in the audience to be able to ask a question or two. Tell us a story around an entrepreneur, a social enterprise that you or your colleagues at .org have backed that you all are just so proud of, that really inspires.
Yeah, I was talking about the Center for Policing Equity earlier, so maybe I'll just stick with that organization. But how many people are familiar with Dr. Phil Goff and the work that he's done? All right, very few. Great, that's awesome. I get to tell them about Phil Goff. I get to be the first person to share this incredible person with you. So Phil Goff is a professor at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. He's been doing sort of this very sort of on the cutting edge data analysis around policing for a long time. And a lot of people ask, like, how do I get a Google.org grant? Unfortunately, for most of the grants we give, it's not an open process. It's really sort of this iterative thing. And Phil, I first got exposed to Phil after the Alton Sterling and Philando Castile shootings. There was another professor at Harvard, Roland Fryer, who published a paper that challenged the assumption that there was any racial disparity in the use of force by police. And that article got forwarded to me by some of our executives, and I was looking for, honestly, a rebuttal to that paper. And I kind of blasted out to my network, the Black Lives Matter folks and the Live Free folks and some of my grantees, and said, give me something to rebut. This just can't I'm open to the intellectual possibility of this being true, but it just goes so much against lived experience. And they sent me back Phil's research paper that he had done on the Houston Police Department and the statistical significance of use of force and racial disparities, and African Americans were something like 5 times more likely to have force used against them in a stop. And that was the first time I'd ever sort of registered Phil Goff on my radar. Then I went to the White House. I had the opportunity to, in the past administration, visit with Valerie Jarrett and Attorney General Lynch. and Dr. Goff was at the meeting, and I met him, and I was actually talking to him for a couple of minutes before I realized who he was. I'm like, wait, you're Dr. Goff? Like, I read your paper, that paper was dope, like, you saved my life, like, you kept my portfolio afloat, like, I owe you so much. And he was just so passionate and compelling, and I said, all right, next time I'm in New York, I'm gonna stop by, we'll have a conversation. And a couple of months later, I was in New York, I stopped by. I literally, like, 5 minutes in the conversation, not that this is not necessarily typical, but whatever, this is what happened. I was sitting with my colleague Samantha, and I literally looked across the table at Phil, and I said, what would you do with $5 million? Like, if I have $5 million left in my budget, I got a week to spend it, what would you do with it? And he said, literally, we would change the face of policing in this country. I would expand to, like, X number of cities, and we're gonna build the first national database on policing. And I was like, done. Where do I sign? So that's just one story of sort of how it happened. I mean, a lot of times it is very much through sort of trusted networks, and there's obviously a little bit of self-selection bias when you're depending on word of mouth, and which is why we try to come to conferences like this one, so we can make sure we're not missing good ideas and get exposed to people.
Questions? Go ahead.
You mentioned it earlier, Megan Smith mentioned about getting tech people in nonprofit organizations. It's very hard to recruit tech people, right? They're valued pretty highly, software engineers. Nonprofits can really not pay them that well. So what are some strategies that work, or where should one go to find them? What attracts people? Like, how do you recruit for that?
Premal, that might be a question for you, my friend. You're the one who's the inspirational founder, CEO, trying to figure out how to solve it.
It's a struggle, and it's something that really limits our impact at Kiva. And we have all these things going for us, like a fairly large brand and all that stuff. Some of the tactics that we've taken are trying to, if your nonprofit's at a size that you can actually expose your APIs, we then have managed to build a small developer community, and then have hired from that developer community. Because people will self-select in as really being passionate about your mission. We've had a lot of failures. I mean, I remember in the early days, I was begging, Google and others, just, like a 6-month externship, and, just like, could we do something like this? And the truth is just to ramp people on your development environment, and, the ROI, like, unless people stay, it's not how Google does software development, having, like, temporary employees come through. So here's the wisdom after 12 years at Kiva, that I think the highest compensated employees and kind of resourcing for technology. It's the biggest line item in our budget. It's where we go, and I'm also a proponent of less people, higher paid now in technology, and then higher standards.
Amen.
Other questions?
Hi, thank you for the conversation. Very interesting. You talked about proximity to humanity. There's a lot of movements going on today, especially with Me Too and what have you, Time's Up, and some of the bigger movements that are getting so much more visibility. What's Google.org doing about these movements, and where do you see your support to such initiatives? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why Google.org exists, is that we can amplify some of these movements. And again, not to have Google necessarily step out on the front of the movements or lead the movements, but a lot of the conversation is how do we amplify and provide information and get behind people who are taking courageous steps. So, my work directly with the racial justice portfolio has certainly been to find leaders like Patrisse Cullors, who's one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, and really get behind her in a significant way, or Pastor Michael McBride, who's doing movement organizing around urban gun violence and getting behind him in a significant way. I mentioned Callisto, and trying to get behind organizations that are using technology to try to prevent sexual assaults on campus, and now moving into other spheres as well. So, certainly, and I would also just point out, like, our employee voice is a huge part of that. I think all the work that my teammates do to rally Googlers, to channel Googlers' energy. They're constantly creating campaigns to raise their own personal money. $100 million a year of their personal money to support those as well, and trying to make sure that we're amplifying their voice to be able to be connected to those movements. So there's lots of things that I couldn't name them all in this session, but those are some of the things that we do.
Well, our time's up here, and let's give a round of applause. Thank you, Justin, for being here with us.